Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. This is the final chapter of Robert Ogman's Against the Nation, Anti-National Politics in Germany. The chapter is titled, what the hell is the chapter title? Let's find that out, huh? Anti-National Perspectives. So let's go. The campaigns Never Again Germany and Something Better Than the Nation were amongst the first explicitly anti-national projects that emerged in Germany and set the grounds for an anti-national tendency that continues to this day. But what precisely set these projects apart from the left's inherited stance on the nation? What are the contours of the anti-national position today? And what relevance might an anti-national perspective have for anti-capitalist struggles elsewhere? New section. The German left on nationalism before 1989. With the absolute rejection of the nation, the group, the radical left, and the welfare committee, and the countless anti-national projects that followed them, proposed an explicit break with the left's inherited position on, quote, the national question. For both the old and the new lefts, the relationship to the nation was one of affirmation, that is, of, quote, self-determination, and of peaceful cooperation with other national collectivities. Quote, proletarian internationalism, end quote, framed the problem in terms of the relationship between national groups, and not in regards to the production and reproduction of these groups themselves and their constructed existence in capitalist nation-states. The Communist Manifesto's rallying cry, "Workers of the World Unite," targeted the antagonisms between workers of different countries in the form of national hostilities, but not as nations as such. The German New Left had strong reservations towards any positive associations with Germany. Quote, the distancing from one's nation, end quote, writes Andrea Ludwig, quote, was constitutive for the emergence of the student movement during the 1960s, end quote. Footnote. See Andrea Ludwig, Die Neue Linke und die Nation, über den linken Umgang mit dem eigenen und dem Fremden in Giuseppe Orsi's edited volume Rechtsphilosophische Hefte, Volume 3. I'm going to look this book up. Let's see. So what is this? What's this book called? Giuseppe Sorry, I'm trying to find this goddamn book and I'm having some trouble here. Seems like this book's by Giuseppe Orsi, Kurt Seelman, and edited by some other people. And this description for this book appears to say, come on, you son of a gun. On the one hand, law is tied to cultures, but it also has a universal claim, particularly in the form of human rights. The contributions examine this tension, particularly with regard to the claim to universality in cross-cultural reception processes. The relationship between human rights and state sovereignty and the modern concept of culture are also discussed. Okay, sorry about that. A lot of time spent looking that up for nothing. But you have to bear with me. Anyway, Andrea Ludwig elaborates, quote, "The fact that the majority of Germans at least tolerated the Nazi crimes and were hardly inclined to hold Nazi criminals accountable after 1945 and to initiate a process of self-criticism was an important moment for the politicization of the students. The rejection of everything associated with the word, quote, German was part of a general opposition to German nationalism and appeared to be the logical conclusion of the confrontation with the history of National Socialism, its remnants in the half-hearted process of, quote, coming to terms with the past, end quote, end quote. Yet, despite their rejection of National Socialism, a direct confrontation with nationalism did not occur. Nationalist positions were in fact existent in the New Left, though often repressed. The prominent student leader, Rudi Dutschke, advocated, quote, socialist reunification, end quote, of East and West Germany, positing a, quote, connection between the national struggle and the class struggle, end quote, and sought to develop a, quote, national self-consciousness, end quote. Rudi Dutschke. Dutschke presented Germany as a victim of foreign aggression and the East-West division as being disconnected from German aggression during World War II. Rudi Dutschke was silent not only about the Holocaust, but also about the role of the Allied powers in liberating Germany from Nazism. Dutschke originally published these views under a pseudonym, and only in the 1970s did he openly present these positions. I might have looked this book up already, but I'm going to look up again. The footnote says, Kundani, Utopia, or Auschwitz. The description for this book says, the full title of the book is Utopia or Auschwitz, Germany's 1968 Generation and the Holocaust by Hans Kundnani. Says, one thing above all separated the radical students who demonstrated on the streets of West Berlin and Frankfurt in 1968 from their counterparts elsewhere around the world. The young Germans who became known as the 1968 generation, or the Achtundsechziger, had grown up knowing that their parents were responsible for Nazism, and in particular for the Holocaust, whether directly or indirectly. Germany's 1968 generation did not merely dream of a better world as some of their contemporaries in other countries did. They felt compelled to act to save Germany from itself. It was an all-or-nothing choice, utopia or Auschwitz. However, although many in the West German student movement imagined their struggle against capitalism as a kind of ex post facto resistance against Nazism, they also had a tendency to relativize the Holocaust. Others, meanwhile, wanted to draw a line under the Nazi past. In fact, despite the anti-fascist rhetoric of the 68 generation, there were also nationalist and anti-Semitic currents in the West German New Left that grew out of the student movement. In short, the 1968 generation had a deeply ambivalent relationship with the Nazi past. Utopia or Auschwitz explores these contradictory currents as it traces the political journey of Germany's 1968 generation via the left-wing terrorism of the 70s and the Social Democrats and the Social Democrats and the Greens in the 80s to political power in the 90s in the form of the first ever, quote, red-green government in Germany. It examines the, quote, red-green government's foreign policy, in particular its response to the Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq crises, which reflected the 1968 generation's ambivalent relationship with the Nazi past. Back to the text. For many others of the New Left, an affirmative German national identity was blocked for many years. Yet during this time, a, quote, substitute nationalism, end quote, Ersatznationalismus, had developed in the movement's support for national self-determination movements in the global South. It was only later that the repressed object of national affirmation returned home, and German nationalism appeared again on the left. One moment. Where the hell am I? I wanted to look up substitute nationalism in the German Wikipedia. Let me try this again. Error. Yeah, I got nothing. I'm sorry about that. In the 1980s, the lack of debate about nationalism eventually led to the embrace of multiculturalism as a response to rising German nationalism. Yet this only affirmed cultural nationalism through the back door. Quote, the preoccupation with the nation, end quote, Andrea Ludwig writes, quote, does not rely upon recourse to loaded terms such as national pride and fatherland, with expressions such as, quote, collective identity, and with the category of culture, national meaning is just as easily transported, end quote. I just was curious to see what the multiculturalism Wikipedia says for Germany real quick. Multiculturalism, mostly pejoratively also called multiculti or multicultural, is the umbrella term for a series of social, philosophical, theoretical approaches with action implications for the social policy of a state. The first section of the Wikipedia definition says, in purely descriptive terms, multiculturalism describes the presence of several cultures in one area. Multiculturalism is often used in a normative sense, according to which people from different cultures should live together without assimilation. According to this interpretation of the term, multiculturalism is a political concept that advocates the protection and recognition of cultural differences. Quote, multiculturalism is the idea that people should not be treated equally despite their differences, but differently because of their differences. End quote. In liberal multiculturalism, cultural differentiation only occurs in the private sphere, while efforts are made to keep the public sphere neutral and to emphasize existing commonalities, e.g. with regard to economic interest or politics instead of differences. Theories of multiculturalism are contrary to the idea of a dominant national culture, as well as to the idea of the melting pot, which is widespread in the USA and assumes an assimilation of the different cultures and the resulting development of a common national culture. The goal of multiculturalism is a multicultural society in... Well, this isn't... Sorry. Never mind. The goal of multiculturalism is a multicultural society in which there should be no state or non-state incentive or, quote, pressure for assimilation. The ethnic and cultural groups, on the other hand, should exist individually. This model is based on the postulate that the members of the respective ethnic groups can show mutual understanding, respect, tolerance, and see each other as equals. Canada is often cited as a positive example of the implementation of multiculturalism. Mostly ethnic groups, such as the French-speaking population of Canada, or religious groups are seen as target groups of multicultural policy. Rarely other groups, such as gender, or groups that are defined by the sexual orientation of their members. In general, however, it is simply about culturally diverse groups of all kinds. Criticism of multiculturalism is expressed by various circles, including supporters of the concept of transculturality. Within the framework of critical multiculturalism, the basic assumption of multiculturalism that ethnic affiliation is the most important identification category for members of society is questioned in the view of the multiple affiliations to different groups that are not only marked ethnically, multi-collectivity. One of the first to critically examine the idea of multiculturalism was the left liberal U.S. historian and close friend of the Kennedy family, Arthur M. Schlesinger. In his book, The Disunity of America, Reflections on a Multicultural Society, published in 1991, Arthur Schlesinger states, with a view to the looming Yugoslavian war and the secession movements in Spain, Catalonia, Great Britain, Scotland, Belgium, Flanders, and other countries, the, quote, inherent fragility of multi-ethnic society, end quote. The fundamental question of the 20th century drawing to a close in the 21st is, what happens when people of different ethnic origins, speaking different languages and practicing different religions, live together in the same geographical region and under the same political authority? If they are not united by a common goal, ethnic hostilities will drive them apart. Ethnic and racial conflicts will, that much seems certain, from now on determine the conflict of ideologies as the explosive problem of our time, end quote. Schlesinger. Similarly, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who of course was the student leader, who wrote a book, Obsolete Communism, with his brother, I think it was Gabriel Cohn-Bendit, which is a very anarchistic text, and he later became a Green Party member. Similarly, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, as founder and first director of the Frankfurt, quote, Office of Multicultural Affairs, had also pointed out the considerable potential for conflict in multicultural society if these are not addressed preventatively. Quote, multicultural society is hard, fast, cruel, and lacks solidarity. It is characterized by considerable social imbalances, ... end quote. This was soon taken up by conservatives, for example, the Bavarian Prime Minister Edmund Stoiber. in his government declaration on the 8th of December 1994. Many opponents of multiculturalism see it as a failure. Former British Prime Minister David Cameron also supports this position. In his speech at the Munich Security Conference on the 5th of February 2011, David Cameron presented segregation and separatism as key issues behind the threat of Islamist extremism and advocated a, quote, common national identity to replace, quote, the doctrine of state multiculturalism, end quote. As a consequence, David Cameron called for, quote, active and strong liberalism, end quote, and announced that state support for Islamist terrorism-promoting organizations should be stopped. The Berlin political scientist and Islamic scholar Ralph Gadban declares the ideology of multiculturalism to be incompatible with the basic principles of free and human rights-oriented society. Quote, the ideology of multiculturalism comes from the philosopher Charles Taylor. His thesis, liberal individualism, leads to people pursuing the satisfaction of their needs and becoming alienated and amoral through the consumer world. This can be corrected by resorting to old structures, namely the community, which provides an authentic identity and good morality. This is accompanied by restrictions on individual freedom, but leads to the abolition of alienation. Charles Taylor uses Marxist terminology, which he, however, completely transforms. I am of the opinion that multiculturalism is not a left-wing ideology, but a reactionary ideology against liberal individualism. Ralph Godban emphasized the importance of human rights as a constitutional basis for democracy. Multiculturalism, on the other hand, lacks a common basis. Following similar positions by German Chancellor Angela Merkel, former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, and former Prime Minister of Australia and Spain, John Howard and Jose Maria Aznar, who criticized multiculturalism for standing in the way of success in the integration of immigrants, the Vatican also joined the debate on the 11th of February 2011. As president of the Pontifical Council for Culture, Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi also declared the model of multiculturalism to be a failure, spoke out instead in favor of interculturality, and announced an official Vatican document on the subject. The Rostock ancient historian Agon Flegg criticized the concept of multiculturalism in a conversation with the blog of weekly newspaper Die Zeit several years ago. Quote, multiculturalism is only represented by the so-called left in liberal societies. Outside these societies, there is no multiculturalism, and there never has been, end quote. Where multiculturalism declares the equality and individual rights of all cultures and does not recognize a cross-cultural consensus on values, such as the standard of universal human rights, Flegg also sees, quote, left multiculturalism as being close to, quote, right-wing ethno-political ideas of the, quote, apartheid, of inviolable cultural entities with their respective categories of values and morality. Quote, if every culture had the absolute right to determine what is a crime and what is not, without regard to universal values, then Auschwitz would no longer be a crime, end quote. The German-Syrian political scientist Bassam Tibi, I actually have an article by Bassam Tibi, argues similarly with regard to Muslim immigration to Europe. Quote, for example, cultural relativists tend to accept the fundamentalist demand for the application of Sharia law to Muslims living in Europe in the sense of multicultural tolerance as a, quote, presentation, end quote, of another culture, end quote. However, quote, internal peace in societies in which waves of migration occur, end quote, depends, quote, on the affirmation of an order based on commitment to values, end quote. Tony Schuberl, a member of the Green Party in the Bavarian State Parliament, pointed out a particular contradiction, according to which the Bavarian State Parliament had simultaneously anchored, quote, a definition of multiculturalism, end quote, in the preamble to the Bavarian Integration Act, along with defining what he saw as a, quote, chauvinistic dominant culture. Article 3, Paragraph 1, Sentence 1 of the Bavarian Integration Act states, quote, successful integration requires mutual consideration and tolerance, as well as respect for the uniqueness of each other's life stories and influences, end quote. The political buzzword multiculturalism is sometimes used in debates to make derogatory comments about the assumed or actual multicultural ideology of the other party. Okay, so thank you for that detour. Back to the text. In the 1980s, the lack of debate about nationalism eventually led to the embrace of multiculturalism as a response to rising German nationalism. Yet this only affirmed cultural nationalism through the back door. Quote, the preoccupation with the nation, end quote, Ludwig writes, quote, does not rely upon recourse to loaded terms such as national pride and fatherland, with expressions such as, quote, collective identity, and with the category of culture, national meaning is just as easily transported, end quote. Sorry, I already read that. Against this background, the explicitly anti-national perspectives after 1989 represent a rupture with earlier traditions and provide the beginnings of a new orientation. But what are the general contours of this anti-national perspective? One second. I'm trying to find if there's a German Wikipedia page just in general for anti-nationalism. Sorry about this. Anti-nationalism, how's that translate into German? Let's see if there's a Wikipedia for this. Okay. Not seeing anything. Sorry about that. Although the campaigns Never Again Germany and Something Better Than the Nation were triggered by different aspects of resurgent nationalism, the radical left by the organization, by geopolitical developments, and the welfare committee by nationalism from below, both projects developed all-encompassing critiques targeting both state and civil society levels. The Never Again Germany campaign focused on the geopolitical aspects of the new national consensus, opposing the reconstruction of political power and economic influence after the collapse of East Germany, and the attempts of an expanded West Germany to increase its role internationally. This shows a focus on the level of the nation-state and the increasing relevance of a national narrative for its political and economic pursuits. The Welfare Committee and the Something Better Than the Nation caravan, on the other hand, concentrated on the spike in hostility and violence towards migrants in the early 1990s. They focused on the relationship between nationalism and racism from below and in the media, and their dynamic interplay with public policy, as for example with the abdication of asylum rights. The Never Again Germany campaign, however, was no less limited to a geopolitical critique. It also targeted the renationalization of civil society and societal consensus that made the political unification possible. That is to say, it focused on the domestic national consensus. In fact, Bernhard Schmidt describes this, quote, ideological consensus as, quote, the point of departure of the, quote, anti-national, end quote, debate. Similarly, the work of the welfare committees did not remain confined to the level of civil society. Instead, the group saw political events as playing a nurturing role for nationalism from below. Political unification and political unification's accompanying national narrative provided impetus for hostility towards those viewed as outside of the national collectivity and gave weight to patriarchal conceptions about how this collectivity should be organized internally. But neither group stopped there. Not only did they draw out the connections between nationalism on state and civil society levels, providing an explanation of resurgent German nationalism as the result of conjunctural political factors, as for example of the reunification, they also saw nationalism as a central component of the normal functioning of capitalist society. For never again Germany and the welfare committees. Nationalism was not random or arbitrary, nor could nationalism be disregarded as mere, quote, false consciousness, end quote. Instead, nationalist positions derive from the structure of capitalist nation-states with their competitive labor markets and international competition, which are made explicit, radicalized, and often racialized in concrete political contexts. The struggle against nationalism, therefore, would also have to be directed against the basic structure of capitalist society from which nationalism springs. New section, Against the Nation. The contours of an anti-national orientation for both the organization, Radical Left, and the welfare committees is defined by an absolute, concrete, negative universalism. The absolute rejection of the nation strongly contrasts to approaches centering upon the cultivation of a post-national or transnational or European identity. Instead of a strategy of gradual and expanding forms of inclusion, they oppose the nation outright, challenging the nation's grounds of legitimation and of structural existence. Neither mobilization sought to contain or humanize a German identity or to preserve it by routing out national, quote, chauvinism or, quote, excesses, nor did they defend a more, quote, respectable Germany against the nationalist frenzy or attempt to preserve or protect it against, quote, misuse. They did not long for a pre-1989 post-national collective identity nor a pre-Nazi collective identity. While scattered references could be found that positively asserted West Germany's, quote, multinational character or affirmed multiculturalism against an ethnically homogeneous national conception, such statements were marginal and largely absent from the project's theoretical elucidations. The only fleeting mention of such views is found in the short statement, thesis paper on the topic, Ethnic National Minorities. The dominant position did not propose or affirm an alternative collective identity. It was strictly negative in its approach. This absolute rejection of the nation did not result in an over-identification with those subjects excluded or marginalized from national belonging. In other words, despite the practical and symbolic defense of asylum seekers and other migrants, these groups did not play the role of ersatz identity for a rejected German one in the way that Latin American, Asian, African, and Arab identities did for some segments of the New Left. The anti-national critique was concrete in the sense that it did not emerge out of abstract theoretical considerations, but from struggles against actually existing forms of German nationalism in the political conjuncture after 1989. It was also concrete in the sense that the anti-national campaigns did not propose an abstract conception of humanity, but rather responded to acute societal threats as they were occurring. They opposed the conceptual, practical, and legal restrictions whereby nations were organized. This praxis of negation was directed at the actually existing national form as it presented itself, and against its radicalization and renewed ethnicization in the early 1990s. On the cultural level, it involved a deconstruction of cultural and historical narratives. On the state level, it meant opposing delimited citizenship rights, national borders, and great migration controls. And in the realm of civil society, it tried to counter physical violence and daily practices of exclusion. Opposition on a structural level was seen in the Never Again Germany campaign's protest against the, quote, Aliens Act and other similar migration control policies by Germany and the European Union, where they basically rejected any restrictions on migration or civil and political rights for those who lived in or desired to live in West Germany. The Wohlfahrtsausschüsse, the welfare committees, also expressed unconditional universalistic demands against the constitutional reform of asylum rights. Both of these examples show a negative universalism against migration controls, national borders, and the differentiated allotment of political rights. This concrete negative universalist anti-nationalism is sharply contrasted to an abstract universalist anti-nationalism found in broad sections of the left. Take, for example, the autonomous theorist George Kastiafakis' approach to the topic. One second. One second. George Kastiafakis. The Wikipedia for George Kastiafakis says, George Kastiafakis is a Greek-American historian and social theorist. Greek Kastiafakis is a theorist known for his many writings on social movements, including The Imagination of the New Left, The Global Analysis of 1968, and The Subversion of Politics, European Autonomous Social Movements, and the Decolonization of Everyday Life. George Kastiafakis was a professor of humanities and sociology at the Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston from 1985 up till his retirement in 2015. George Kastiafakis sits on the editorial board of New Political Science, published by the Caucus for a New Political Scientist. After Caucus for a New Political Science. After being mentored by Herbert Marcuse, Kastiafakis created the concept of the, quote, Eros effect, an analytical tool for explaining mass political awakenings and spontaneous rebellions which sweep through the world in certain time periods. According to this theory, economics and technology alone cannot account for the spread of these movements. Instead, it posits that humanist instincts for liberty and justice are triggered by persistent inequality and explode virally across populations. Kastiafakis writes that, quote, in moments of Eros effect, universal interests become generalized at the same time as the dominant values of society are negated, such as national chauvinism, hierarchy, and individualism, end quote. Other scholars of the theory note that, quote, rebellions in both industrial and pre-industrial nations exhibit shared interest in anti-authoritarian self-governance, international solidarity, the transformation of everyday life, and the promotion of alternative values and ethics, end quote. Kastiafakis and others have applied this framework to the anti-globalization movement, the people power uprisings in Asia in the 1980s, especially in the Gwangju uprising and the Arab Spring, among other events. Back to the text. In George Kastiafakis' book on the German and Italian autonomous movements, Kastiafakis criticizes the German autonomists for focusing on the particularities of German nationalism. In Kastiafakis' view, such efforts only affirm it, and thereby obstruct the path towards the, quote, universal species. To reach this goal, Kastiafakis claims the contrary approach is required. Instead of identifying the particularities of German nationalism, one should, quote, filter out the German dimension, end quote, and highlight universal human capacities. There's a footnote that I missed. Actually, there's a couple that I missed. One says, this topic would eventually become a central debate within the movement. On the one hand, anti-national critique was aimed at understanding the normal presence of nationalism as a central component of capitalist society, which becomes prominent at particular political junctures. On the other hand, the historical attempt of the National Socialist regime to establish a Volksgemeinschaft, a blood and soil racial community, reveals the capacity of nationalist movements to break with critical aspects of capitalism, instituting racialized authoritarian societies. The footnote that I was looking for is that I was just said. The most recent footnote says George Kastiafakis, The Subversion of Politics, European Autonomous Social Movements, and the Decolonization of Everyday Life. Where am I? Trying to find the description for this book. Fuck. Well, the subversion of politics is on Libcom. The description for the subversion of politics. I read this book like when I was, I don't know, in community college. A scholarly gem. It starts off with some. The description starts off with some praise. A scholarly gem which is indispensable reading for anyone interested in how social change occurs, especially in advanced industrial countries. Coral Boggs. This book is an important corrective to the all-too-common view that global capitalism is triumphant, that there is no basis for opposing the values it promotes. Barbara Epstein, University of California at Santa Cruz. Since the modern anti-globalization movement kicked off with the 1999 WTO protests in Seattle, a new generation has been engaging in anti-capitalist direct action. Its aims, politics, lifestyles, and tactics grow directly out of the autonomous social movements that emerged in Europe from the 1970s through the mid-1990s. In fact, today's infamous, quote, black blocs are the direct descendants of the European autonomy. But these important historical connections are rarely noted and never understood. The subversion of politics sets the record straight, filling in the gaps between the momentous events of 1968 and 1999. Kastiafakis presents the protagonists of social revolt, Italian feminist squatters, disarmament and anti-nuclear activists, punk rockers, and anti-fascist street fighters in a compelling and sympathetic light. At the same time, he offers a work of great critical depth, drawing from these political practices a new theory of freedom and autonomy that redefines the parameters of the political itself. Back to the text. In stark contrast to the anti-national perspective, which sees nationalism as a fundamentally modern phenomenon bound to capitalist society, this abstract universalist position treats nationalism as a mere residue of pre-modern and pre-capitalist societies. According to Kastiafakis, it is nothing more than the, quote, cultural remnants of tribalism and superstition, or, quote, psychological remnants, which have yet to be transcended by civilizational progress. While nationalism certainly has roots in pre-capitalist societal formations, this position fails to account for the ways nationalism is produced within capitalist societies. as central ideological and structural components of their functioning. The result of Castiophicus's approach, like many of the participants in the autonomous movement themselves, was to downplay the rapidly increasing role of nationalism in the post-1989 period, or to reduce it to a problem of neo-fascism or racism. In contrast to such an approach, the anti-nationalists intervened directly in the social historical context and sought to disrupt its trajectory. This strongly contrasts with the tendency based on abstract universalism, which responds to nationalism by fleeing from or denying association with the particular German historical situation. Indeed, the anti-national critique was directed precisely at German politics and history in order to create a specifically German anti-national movement. One must Maria Bader and Gottlinda Magariba Lavanga insisted, quote, place oneself finally as woman, as leftist, as German, as white person in the history, end quote, which specifically involved the recognition that nationalism, racism, and anti-Semitism, quote, have a dynamic and a function which we have something to do with, end quote. Therefore, to the activists of the Never Again Germany campaign, an anti-national position was not an abstraction, but a concrete reckoning with the social world one found oneself in. Following this logic, they explicitly sought, quote, to create the basis for a German anti-national movement, end quote. In both campaigns, the anti-national perspective was not limited to a critique of exclusionary aspects of a delimited national collectivity, and particularly towards the exclusion of asylum seekers and non-German immigrants from this collective. Instead, they saw nationalism as having specific disadvantages even for some of those who belonged to the nation. This we saw in the way the radical left addressed the rising levels of female unemployment following the privatization of East German industries and their reincorporation into the nation through unpaid domestic labor. The nationalist narrative helped to rationalize this gender division of labor and social segmentation by presenting women not only as caretakers of the family, but of the nation as a whole. This role allocation was supported by a patriarchal gender narrative and a national managerial position, which sought to ease the labor market of superfluous labor power in service of the national economy. Class differences were also emphasized in the campaigns, arguing that low-wage workers would not see any of the economic benefits of political unification. Quote, modernization under capitalist conditions involves polarization, yet societal consent for this project would be secured through a depiction of the nation as a horizontal community, of the belief that, quote, we're all in the same boat, end quote. The focus on nationalism's oppressive implications, even for some of those included, marked a strong contrast to liberal theories of nationalism defined as inter-ethnic conflict. In contrast to this view, they saw nationalism as a central element for the production and reproduction of modern capitalist societies. This meant that they saw it as a phenomenon presented at the level of state and civil society, something that was used to justify public policy, racial violence and gender role allocation, and for the construction of a national personal identity. As seen in the Never Again Germany campaign, nationalism was viewed as the narrative component for an expanded German state, incorporating East Germany. In the projects of the welfare committees, we saw how they understood national narratives as being used to justify forms of exclusion of those said to not belong to the, quote, national community, end quote, whether that be by means of direct violence in civil society or by the mediated force of the state. New section, Capitalism and the Nation State. Participants of both campaigns saw the nation as a highly modern construct rather than a trans-historical constant. Sometimes directly citing the words of social theorist Benedict Anderson, they described nations as, quote, imagined political communities, end quote. I looked up Anderson in a previous video. Nations, they persistently argued, did not preclude modern nation states, but were rather products of nationalism and of the nation state. Agreeing with Ernest Gellner and Karl Marx, nationalism was viewed as closely bound to the social order, even a result of it. Nations are in fact products of nationalisms and not the other way around. Okay, so there's a couple of books cited in the footnotes. There's Ernest Gellner's Nations and Nationalism and Eric J. Hobsbawm's Nations and Nationalism since 1780, Program Myth Reality. I'm going to look these up. I'm going to read the Wikipedia for Ernest Gellner first. Ernest Gellner lived from 1925 to 1995 and was a British Czech philosopher and social anthropologist described by the Daily Telegraph when he died as one of the world's most vigorous intellectuals, and by the Independent as a, quote, one-man crusader for critical rationalism, end quote. His first book, Words and Things, published in 1959, prompted a leader in the Times and a month-long correspondence on its letters page over his attack on linguistic philosophy. As professor of philosophy, logic, and scientific method at the London School of Economics for 22 years, the William Wise Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge for 8 years, and head of the new Center for the Study of Nationalism in Prague, Gellner fought all his life in his writings, teaching, and political activism against what he saw as closed systems of thought, particularly communism, psychoanalysis, relativism, and the dictatorship of the free market. Bracket clarification needed. Bracket citation needed. Among other issues in social thought, modernization theory and nationalism were two of his central themes. His multicultural perspective, allowing Gellner to work within the subject matter of three separate civilizations, Western, Islamic, and Russian. Gellner is considered one of the leading theoreticians on the issue of nationalism. Gellner was born in Paris to Anna, née Fentel, and Rudolf, a lawyer, an urban intellectual, German-speaking, Austrian-Jewish couple from Bohemia, which since 1918 was part of the newly established Czechoslovakia. Julius Gellner was his uncle. He was brought up in Prague, attended a Czech-language primary school before entering the English-language grammar school. This was Franz Kafka's tricultural Prague, anti-Semitic but, quote, stunningly beautiful, a city he later spent longing for. In 1939, when Gellner was 13, the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany persuaded his family to leave Czechoslovakia and move to St. Albans, just north of London, where Gellner attended St. Albans Boys' Modern School, now Verulam School, Hertfordshire. At the age of 17, Gellner won a scholarship to Balliol College, Oxford, as a result of what he called, quote, Portuguese colonial policy, end quote, which involved keeping, quote, the natives peaceful by getting able ones from below into Balliol, end quote. It's actually funny he says this because the same day I was reading The Ideas of Leon Trotsky, and it was a piece about Victor Serge, and one of the important people in the historiography of Victor Serge is a guy named Peter Sedgwick, who was kind of like on the libertarian end of international socialist Tony Cliff's Tony Cliff Trotskyism. And he did the same thing. He was actually got a scholarship to Balliol. At Balliol, Ernest Gellner studied philosophy, politics, and economics and specialized in philosophy. Gellner interrupted his studies after 1 year to serve with the 1st Czechoslovak Armored Brigade, which took part in the Siege of Dunkirk, 1944-45, and then returned to Prague to attend university there for half a term. During this period, Prague lost its strong hold over him. Foreseeing the communist takeover, Gellner decided to return to England. One of Gellner's recollections of the city in 1945 was a communist poster saying, "Everyone with a clean shield into the party," ostensibly meaning that those with records were good during the occupation were welcome. In reality, Gellner said it meant exactly the opposite. Quote, "If your shield is absolutely filthy, we'll scrub it for you. You are safe with us. We like you better because the filthier your record, the more we have a hold on you." So all the bastards, all the distinctive authoritarian personalities, rapidly went into the party, and it rapidly acquired this kind of character. So it was coming was totally clear to me, and it cured me of the emotional hold which Prague had previously had over me. I could foresee that a Stalinoid dictatorship was due. It came in 48. The precise date I couldn't foresee, but that it was due to come was absolutely obvious for various reasons. I wanted no part of it and got out as quickly as I could and forgot about it. End quote. Ernest Gellner returned to Balliol College in 1945 to finish his degree, winning the John Locke Prize and taking first-class honors in 1947. The same year, he began his academic career at the University of Edinburgh as an assistant to Professor John McMurray in the Department of Moral Philosophy. He moved to the London School of Economics in 1949, joining the Sociology Department under Morris Ginsburg. Ginsburg admired philosophy and believed that philosophy and sociology were very close to each other. Quote, "He helped me because I was a philosopher. Even though he was technically a professor of sociology, he wouldn't employ his own students. So I benefited from this, and he assumed that anybody in philosophy would be an evolutionary Hobbesian like himself. It took him some time to discover that I wasn't." End quote. Leonard Trelawney Hobsbawm had preceded Ginsburg as Martin White Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics. Hobsbawm's Mind and Evolution, published in 1901, had proposed that society should be regarded as an organism, a product of evolution with the individual as its basic unit, the subtext being that society would improve over time as it evolved, a teleological view that Gellner firmly opposed. Quote, Morris Ginsburg, was totally unoriginal and lacked any sharpness. Morris Ginsburg simply reproduced the kind of evolutionary rationalistic vision which had already been formulated by Hobsbawm, and which incidentally was a kind of extrapolation of his own personal life, starting in Poland and ending up as a fairly influential professor at LSE. He had an idea of a great chain of being where the lowest form of life was the drunk Polish anti-Semitic peasant, and the next stage was the Polish gentry a bit better, or the Datel, better still. And then he came to England, first to University College under Dawes Hicks, who was quite rational, not all that rational. He still had some anti-Semitic prejudices, it seems, and finally ended up at LSE with Hobsbawm, who was so rational that rationality came out of his ears. And so Ginsburg extrapolated this, and on his view, the whole of humanity moved to ever greater rationality, from drunk Polish peasant to T.L. Hobsbawm and a Hampstead Arden. End quote. Ernest Gellner's critique of linguistic philosophy in Words and Things focused on J.L. Austin and the later work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, criticizing them for failing to question their own methods. The book brought Gellner critical acclaim. He obtained his Ph.D. in 1961 with a thesis on organization and the role of Berber Zavia, and became professor of philosophy, logic, and scientific method just 1 year later. Thought and Change was published in 1965, and in State and Society and Soviet Thought, published in 1988, he examined whether Marxist regimes could be liberalized. Gellner was elected to the British Academy in 1974. Gellner moved to Cambridge in 1984 to head the Department of Anthropology, holding the William Wise Chair, and became a Fellow of King College, Cambridge, which provided him with a relaxed atmosphere where he enjoyed drinking beer and playing chess with the students. Described by the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography as, quote, brilliant, forceful, irrelevant, mischievous, sometimes perverse, with a biting wit and love of irony, end quote. Ernest Gellner was famously popular with his students, was willing to spend many extra hours a day tutoring them, and was regarded as a superb public speaker and gifted teacher. Gellner's Plough, Sword, and Book, published in 1988, investigated the philosophy of history, and Conditions of Liberty, 1994, sought to explain the collapse of socialism with an analogy he called, quote, modular man. In 1993, Ernest Gellner returned to Prague, now rid of communism, and to the new Central European University, where Gellner became head of the Center for the Study of Nationalism, a program funded by George Soros, the American billionaire philanthropist, to study the rise of nationalism in post-communist countries of Eastern and Central Europe. On the 5th of November 1995, after returning from a conference in Budapest, Ernest Gellner had a heart attack and died at his flat in Prague, 1 month short of his 70th birthday. Ernest Gellner was a member of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. With the publication in 1959 of Words and Things, Gellner's first book, Gellner achieved fame and even notoriety among Gellner's fellow philosophers, as well as outside the discipline for Gellner's fierce attack on, quote, linguistic philosophy, as Gellner preferred to call ordinary language philosophy, then the dominant approach at Oxbridge, although the philosophers themselves denied that they were part of any unified school. Ernest Gellner first encountered the strong ideological hold of linguistic philosophy while at Balliol. Quote, at that time, the orthodoxy best described as linguistic philosophy, inspired by Wittgenstein, was crystallized and seemed to me totally and utterly misguided. Wittgenstein's basic idea was that there is no general solution to issues other than the custom of the community. Communities are ultimate. He didn't put it this way, but that was what it amounted to, and this doesn't make sense in a world in which communities are not stable and are not clearly isolated from each other. Nevertheless, Wittgenstein managed to sell this idea, and it was enthusiastically adopted as an unquestionable revelation. It is very hard nowadays for people to understand what the atmosphere was like then. That was the revelation. It wasn't doubted, but it was quite obvious to me that it was wrong. It was obvious to me the moment I came across it, although initially, if your entire environment and all the bright people in it hold something to be true, you assume you must be wrong, not understanding it properly, and they must be right. And so I explored it further and finally came to the conclusion that I did understand it right and it was rubbish, which indeed it is, end quote. Words and Things is fiercely critical of the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, J.L. Austin, Gilbert Ryle, Antony Flew, P.F. Strawson, and many others. Ryle refused to have the book reviewed in the philosophical journal Mind, which he edited, and Bertrand Russell, who had written an approving foreword, protested in a letter to the Times. A response from Ryle and a lengthy correspondence ensued. In the 1950s, Gellner discovered his great love of social anthropology. Chris Hahn, director of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, writes that following the hard-nosed empiricism of Bronislaw Malinowski, Ernest Gellner made major contributions to the subject over the next 40 years, ranging from, quote, conceptual critiques and the analysis of kinship to frameworks for understanding political order outside the state in tribal Morocco. From sympathetic exposition of the works of Soviet Marxist anthropologists to elegant syntheses of the Durkheimian and Weberian traditions in Western social theory, and from grand elaborations of, quote, the structure of human history, end quote, to path-breaking analyses of ethnicity and nationalism, Thought and Change, 1964, and Nations and Nationalism, 1983. Ernest Gellner also developed a friendship with the Moroccan-French sociologist Paul Pascan, whose work he admired. In 1983, Gellner published Nations and Nationalism. For Gellner, quote, nationalism is primarily a political principle that holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent, end quote. Gellner argues that nationalism appeared and became a sociological necessity only in the modern world. In previous times, the, quote, agro-literate, end quote, stage of history, rulers had little incentive to impose cultural homogeneity on the ruled, but in modern society, work becomes technical. One must operate a machine, and to do so one must learn. There's a need for impersonal, context-free communication and a high degree of cultural standardization. Furthermore, industrial society is underlined by the fact that there is perpetual growth. Employment types vary and new skills must be learned. Thus, generic employment training precedes specialized job training. On a territorial level, there is competition for the overlapping catchment areas, such as Alsace-Lorraine. To maintain its grip on resources and survival and progress, the state and culture must for these reasons be congruent. Nationalism, therefore, is a necessity. Now I'm going to read the Wikipedia for Gellner's theory of nationalism. Gellner's theory of nationalism was developed by Ernest Gellner over a number of publications from the early 1960s until his 1995 death. Ernest Gellner discussed nationalism in a number of works, starting with Thought and Change, published in 1964, and he most notably developed it in Nations and Nationalism, 1983. Gellner's theory of nationalism is modernist. Gellner defined nationalism as, quote, primarily a political principle which holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent, end quote, and as, quote, the general imposition of a high culture on society where previously low cultures had taken up the lives of the majority, and in some cases the totality, of the population. It means the general diffusion of a school-mediated, academy-supervised idiom codified for the requirements of a reasonably precise bureaucratic and technological communication. It is the establishment of an anonymous, impersonal society with mutually sustainable atomized individuals held together above all by a shared culture of this kind, in place of the previous complex structure of local groups, sustained by folk cultures reproduced locally and idiosyncratically by the microgroups themselves, end quote. Gellner analyzed nationalism by a historical perspective. Gellner saw the history of humanity culminating in the discovery of modernity. Nationalism, did I say the last thing that was end quote? Reproduced locally and idiosyncratically by the microgroups themselves, end quote. Gellner analyzed nationalism by a historical perspective. Gellner saw the history of humanity culminating in the history of modernity, nationalism being a functional element. Modernity, by changes in political and economic system, is tied to the popularization of education, which, in turn, is tied to the unification of language. However, as modernization spread around the world, it did so slowly, and in numerous places, cultural elites were able to resist cultural assimilation and defend their own culture and language successfully. For Gellner, nationalism was a sociological condition, and a likely but not guaranteed, he noted exceptions in multilingual states like Switzerland, Belgium, and Canada, result of modernization, the transition from agrarian to industrial society. Gellner's theory focused on the political and cultural aspects of that transition. In particular, Gellner focused on the unifying and culturally homogenizing roles of the educational systems, national labor markets, and improved communication and mobility in the context of urbanization. He thus argued that nationalism was highly compatible with industrialization and served the purpose of replacing the ideological void left by both the disappearance of the prior agrarian society culture and the political and economical system of feudalism which it legitimized. Thomas Hyland Erickson lists these as, quote, some of the central features of nationalism, end quote, in Gellner's theory. Shared formal educational system, cultural homogenization, and, quote, social entropy, central monitoring of polity with extensive bureaucratic control, linguistic standardization, national identification as abstract community, cultural similarity as a basis for political legitimacy, anonymity, single-stranded social relationships. Gellner also provided a typology of, quote, nationalism-inducing and nationalism-thwarting situations, end quote. Gellner criticized a number of other theoretical explanations of nationalism, including the, quote, naturality theory, end quote, which states that it is, quote, natural, self-evident, and self-generating, end quote, and a basic quality of human being, and a neutral or positive quality, its dark version, the, quote, dark gods theory, end quote, which sees nationalism as an inevitable expression of basic human atavistic irrational passions, and Elie Coudreau's idealist argument that it was an accidental development, an intellectual error of disseminating unhelpful ideas, and not related to industrialization and the Marxist theory in which nations appropriated the leading role of social classes. On October 24, 1995, at Warwick University, Gellner debated one of his former students, Anthony D. Smith, in what became known as the Warwick debates. Anthony D. Smith presented an ethno-symbolist view, Gellner a modernist view. The debate has been described as epitomizing their positions. Gellner is considered one of the leading theoreticians on nationalism. Erickson notes that, quote, nobody can test Ernest Gellner's central place in the research on nationalism over the last few decades, end quote. Earlier refers to the theory as, quote, the best-known modernist explanatory theory of nationalism, end quote. Gellner's theory has been subject to various criticisms. It's a list of criticisms. It is too functionalist, as it explains the phenomenon with reference to the eventual historic outcome that industrial society could not, quote, function without nationalism. It misreads the relationship between nationalism and industrialization. It accounts poorly for national movements of ancient Rome and Greece, since it insists that nationalism is tied to modernity, and so cannot exist without a clearly defined modern industrialization. It fails to account for either nationalism in non-industrial society and resurgences of nationalism in post-industrial society. It fails to account for nationalism in 16th century Europe. It cannot explain the passions generated by nationalism and why anyone should fight or die for a country. It fails to take into account either the role of war and the military in fostering both cultural homogenization and nationalism, or the relationship between militarism and compulsory education. It has been compared to technological determinism as it disregards the views of individuals. Philip Gorski has argued that modernization theorists such as Gellner have gotten the timing of nationalism wrong. Nationalism existed prior to modernity and even had medieval roots. And finally, the Wikipedia on Nations and Nationalism is an influential 1983 book by the philosopher Ernest Gellner, in which the author expands on his theory of nationalism. O'Leary describes the book as, quote, Gellner's most elaborate statement on the subject of nationalism because it is largely an expansion of the themes first sketched in Thought and Change. Gellner never reputed any of the core propositions advanced in these texts, end quote, but he clarifies and qualifies some of them further in his Encounters with Nationalism, published in 1994. Okay, so that's Ernest Gellner. And I want to look up the book by Hobsbawm. The description of Hobsbawm's Nations and Nationalism since 1780, Program Myth Reality, says, Eric Hobsbawm's brilliant inquiry into the question of nationalism won further acclaim for his, quote, colossal stature, his incontrovertible excellence as a historian, and his authoritative, highly readable prose, end quote. Recent events in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics have since reinforced the central importance of nationalism in the history of political evolution and upheaval. The second edition has been dated in the light of those events, with a final chapter addressing the impact of the dramatic changes that have taken place. It also includes additional maps to illustrate nationalities, languages, and political divisions across Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. Where am I? Sorry, I'm seeing if there's anything on his thoughts on nationalism on Wikipedia, but there's not. Okay, thank you for that long allowing me that long side detour into the biography and thought of Ernest Gellner. One sees also the influence of Eric Hobsbawm in their work when one reads his view of the nation. Not only did Hobsbawm agree with the modern theories of nationalism and with the, quote, element of artifact invention and social engineering which enters into the making of nations, end quote. Hobsbawm also saw the role of nationalism in the nation-state in producing nations. Hobsbawm wrote, quote, I do not regard the, quote, nation as a primary nor as an unchanging social entity. The nation belongs exclusively to a particular and historically recent period. The nation is a social entity only insofar as it relates to a certain kind of modern territorial state, the, quote, nation state, and it is pointless to discuss the nation and nationality except insofar as both relate to it. ... In short, for the purpose of analysis, nationalism comes before nations. Nations do not make states and nationalisms, but the other way around. End quote. Hobsbawm. The central role of capitalism within modern nation-states occupied a critical role in the anti-nationalist views on nationalism. For them, the competitive logic of capitalist society was seen as a main source for the development of nationalism, both on the internal domestic level of competition between individuals on the labor market, as well as between nation-states on the international level. This competition is, quote, ethnicized, and the state is drawn upon by the populace to preserve or to give advantage to the, quote, national community from which the state draws its legitimacy. As the nation is, quote, inherently limited, end quote, these movements refuse this delimited collectivity and the differential allotment of political rights. As a result of their view of the bounded relationship between nationalism, the nation, and the nation-state, the response to nationalism resulted in the rejection of the nation-state as a specific form of political rule, and not only to oppose nationalism as a form of, quote, excessive, end quote, national feeling. New section. The left and the people. In view of broad public approval for political unification, the anti-national movement was deeply estranged from the German civilian population. Yet, as verbal and physical attacks on minorities skyrocketed in the early 1990s, this relationship became one of increasing conflict. Whereas social movements often hold an affirmative attitude towards, quote, society against the state, just as labor movements affirm workers against capital, the post-1989 national consensus threw this orientation into disarray. The, quote, masses were not simply passive victims of capitalism, but were active in capitalism's making, and in some cases, of deeply reactionary turns. Reactionary politics can emerge from below. With this observation, how should the left respond? For participants of these two campaigns, the general population was seen not as a mere object ruled over by the state, but as a conglomeration of subjects pushing for or approving of certain social and political developments. For the anti-nationalist groups, it became less a force to be mobilized and increasingly one to be opposed. This was most clear in the case of the Never Again Germany campaign, based on a strategy of building a counterpower from within left-wing social movements to the political unification and supporters within the population. In the case of the Wohlfahrtsausschüsse, the welfare committees, the relation to the population was more complicated. Originally, they employed a strategy of cultural intervention, supporting people in East Germany towards the construction of a public force in opposition to the resurgent right. Yet, the welfare committee's conclusion was that this endeavor was a complete failure, that the German population was indifferent, if not actively involved, in the pogroms against asylum seekers, foreign contract workers, and other, quote, non-Germans, created deep mistrust towards the population, which would strongly influence left projects in the future. The German public came to be seen, as in some sense, as a hindrance to progressive or emancipatory aims, and as an object of critique and opposition. With the campaigns against nationalism in the early 1990s, we witnessed the development of an approach that not only opposed nationalism, but also rejected the concept of the nation and the political formation of the nation-state. The campaigns marked the beginning of an anti-national praxis, targeting different aspects of the new, quote, national consensus, unquote. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, they produced novel perspectives that broke with previous approaches to the topics of nationalism, the nation, and the nation-state. New section, the global economic crisis today. Immediately following the financial meltdown of 2007-2008, nationalist movements were on the rise. In Germany, the populist pro-Germany movements gained broader appeal with the help of centrist political leaders who blamed immigration for the supposed downfall of the country. The German finance minister of Berlin and chairman of the German central bank, the Social Democratic Party's Thilo Sarrazin, accused Turkish and Muslim communities in Germany of bringing about economic and cultural ruin. Wikipedia says Thilo Sarrazin, born 1945, is a German politician and former member of the SPD, writer, senator of finance for the state of Berlin from January 2002 until April 2009, former member of the executive board of the Deutsche Bundesbank until 2010. Thilo Sarrazin became well known after publishing a controversial book about Muslim immigrants in Germany in 2010. In his book Deutschland schafft sich ab, Germany abolishes itself, he denounces what he sees as the failure of Germany's post-war immigration policy, sparking a nationwide controversy about the costs and benefits of multiculturalism. As a result, he is no longer a member of the SPD as of the 31st of July 2020. Back to the text. As Greece became caught in the crisis, the German press began a media campaign targeting the supposed cultural characteristics of Southern Europeans. Against all statistical facts, Greeks were said to be working too little, vacationing too much, and going into retirement too early. Footnote. This cultural nationalist campaign and the actual roots of the crisis are explained in Stephen Kaufman, Antonella Muzupapa, and Sabina Noose, Sell Your Islands, You Bankrupt Greeks. 20 popular fallacies concerning the Euro crisis. Let's see if I can find this article. There's a description of this article at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. It says, "It's that time again. Greece needs more loans, and governments in Europe are arguing about whether it's really necessary and who should foot the bill. There is widespread opinion in Germany that Greece itself is to blame for the problems Greece now finds itself in. It first of all cheated its way into the Eurozone, then the government spent too much and the government worked too little. The government spent too much and the governed worked too little, many believe. Latently, nationalistic patterns of interpretation of this kind have been nourished by German politicians and the media, who have no end of proposals for how to, quote, solve the crisis. For example, the Greeks should save more, work more, and sell their public property, and if all these measures do not help, then Greece will just have to leave the Eurozone or declare itself bankrupt. The stupid thing is, neither are the causes of the crisis that have been named actually correct, nor will the proposed ways out of the crisis achieve their goal. back to the text. Where am I? This followed the German government's crisis management strategy at the European Union level, forcing drastic austerity measures upon the population of the southern European state, limiting popular democratic rights, and installing technocratic leaders. In Norway, this anti-immigrant and social chauvinistic line erupted in direct violence when Anders Behring Breivik opened fire on youth attending a summer camp of the Norwegian Labour Party. Anders Anders Behring Breivik is a Norwegian neo-Nazi terrorist. He carried out the 22nd of July 2011 Norway attacks, in which he killed 8 people by detonating a van bomb at Vegeringsfartelet in Oslo, and then killed 69 participants of a Workers' Youth League AUF summer camp in a mass shooting on the island of Utøya. After Breivik was found psychologically competent to stand trial, his criminal trial was held in 2012. That year, Breivik was found guilty of mass murder causing a fatal explosion and terrorism. Breivik was sentenced to the maximum civilian criminal penalty in Norway, which is 21 years in prison through preventive detention, allowing the possibility of 1 or more extensions for as long as he is deemed a danger to society. At the age of 16 in 1995, Breivik was arrested for spraying graffiti on walls. Breivik was not chosen for conscription into the Norwegian Armed Forces. At the age of 20, Breivik joined the anti-immigrant Progress Party and chaired the local West Oslo branch of the party's youth organization in 2002. He joined a gun club in 2005. He left the Progress Party in 2006. A company he founded was later declared bankrupt. Breivik had no declared income in 2009. His assets were 390,000 kroner, equivalent to $72,000, according to Norwegian tax authority figures. Breivik financed the terror attacks with a total of 130,000 euros. 9 credit cards gave him access to credit. On the day of the attacks, Breivik emailed a compendium of texts entitled 2083, a European Declaration of Independence, describing his militant ideology. In them, Breivik stated his opposition to Islam and blamed feminism for a European, quote, cultural suicide. The text called for the deportation of all Muslims from Europe, and Breivik wrote that his main motive for the attacks was to publicize his manifesto. 2 teams of court-appointed forensic psychiatrists examined Breivik before his trial. The first team diagnosed Breivik with paranoid schizophrenia, but after his initial finding was criticized, a second evaluation concluded that he was not psychotic during the attacks, but did have narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. In 2016, Breivik won a partial victory in a lower court. However, the case was lost on appeal in a higher court. Other than that, Breivik has repeatedly but unsuccessfully sued the Norwegian Correctional Service and appealed to the European Convention on Human Rights over solitary confinement and refusal of parole, which Breivik claims violated his human rights. As of December 2024, a 5-day trial is going on in a court of appeals. Breivik is suing the government of Norway for violating his human rights by keeping him in prison isolation. So that's going on now as I'm reading this. The 2011 Norway attacks, also called the 22nd of July, or 22/7 in Norway, were two domestic terrorist attacks by far-right extremist Anders Behring Breivik against the government, the civilian population, and a workers' youth league summer camp in which a total of 77 people were killed. The first attack was a car bomb explosion in Oslo within Regjeringsfartølet, the executive government quarter of Norway. The bomb was placed inside a van next to the tower block housing the office of the Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg. The explosion killed 8 people and injured at least 209 people, 12 severely. The second attack occurred less than 2 hours later at a summer camp on the island of Utøya in Tyrifjorden, Buskerud. The camp was organized by the AUF, the youth wing of the ruling Norwegian Labour Party. Breivik, dressed in a homemade police uniform and showing false identification, took a ferry to the island and opened fire at the participants, killing 69 and injuring 32. Among the dead were friends of Stoltenberg and the stepbrother of Norway's crown princess, Mette-Marit. The Utøya attack is the deadliest mass shooting by a lone individual in modern history. The attack was the deadliest in Norway since World War II. A survey found that 1 in 4 Norwegians knew someone affected. The European Union, NATO, and several countries expressed their support for Norway and condemned the attacks. The 2012 Gjørv report concluded that Norway's police could have prevented the bombing and caught Breivik faster at Utøya, and that measures to prevent further attacks and, quote, mitigate adverse effects, end quote, should have been implemented. The Norwegian police arrested Breivik, a 32-year-old Norwegian far-right extremist, on Utøya Island and charged him with both attacks. His trial took place between the 16th of April and the 22nd of June 2012 in Oslo District Court, where Breivik admitted carrying out the attacks but denied criminal guilt and claimed the defense of necessity. On the 24th of August, Breivik was convicted as charged and sentenced to 21 years of preventative detention in prison with the possibility of indefinite 5-year extensions for public safety, the maximum sentence allowed in Norway. Back to the text. The influence upon the Social Democratic Party by, quote, cultural Marxism, usually a code word for the Jewish left, was apparently behind its supposed support for multiculturalism and liberal immigration policies responsible for the downfall of Christian Europe. England has also seen its nationalist response to the crisis with the slogan "British jobs for British workers" appearing in demonstrations by striking construction workers protesting multinational corporations for wage dumping through the use of foreign labor. While it was right-wing activists who brought the slogan into the labor struggle, it originates with British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He was seeking to win conservative voters back to his party who had drifted to the far right and to push British nationals off the, quote, dole by offering them employment privileges above other European workers. The United States has also experienced the rebirth of nationalism with the populist Tea Party movement, which blames the recession on demographic shifts in the Obama presidency. As a result, the victims of the crisis should pay again, this time through cuts to unemployment aid, welfare and public education, and with the revocation of Obama's health care reforms. The movement's political demands for neoliberal austerity reveal a color line in which existing material benefits for whites would be protected while those for people of color would be reduced. For example, they advocate that the cuts should not apply to government health care and retirement programs disproportionately supporting white retirees. In some cases, the element of white backlash within the Tea Party movement was made explicit. For example, when its popular television leader, Glenn Beck, characterized efforts to extend health care coverage to the millions of uninsured people as, quote, reparations for slavery, end quote. In fact, the source of the problem, according to Tea Party activists, is that the president is not a, quote, real American. For proponents of the, quote, birther conspiracy, a view shared by over 60% of Republicans, Obama is fabricating his U.S. birth certificate to cover up his, quote, real birthplace in Kenya. This focus on, quote, real America has a strong cultural component. As Sarah Palin and many other conservatives propagate, Obama supposedly holds foreign values more in line with European socialism than with American free enterprise. Some participants of the Occupy movement gloss over the nationalist politics of the Tea Party movement, seeing in its supposed anti-government rebellion the seeds of a progressive movement. Adbusters envisioned an Occupy movement that would, quote, transcend the Tea Party and not directly confront the Tea Party. Similarly, the U.S. Day of Rage called on the, quote, nation to rebel against the, quote, elite, to reclaim, quote, American institutions from their usurpation by, quote, oligarchs and, quote, kleptocrats, and echoing the conservative right to, quote, take the country back, end quote, and restore America as a, quote, great nation. The global movements of 2011 beginning in Tunisia and Egypt, erupting in Spain, Greece, and Portugal, spreading across the Atlantic to the United States, inspiring widespread student strikes in Chile and massive protests in Israel, reveals the potential for global left resurgence. But these mobilizations also possess the danger of reaffirming the national framework as a strategy to, quote, solve the global crisis. It must therefore develop ways of seeing this threat, critiquing its particular expressions in distinct contexts, and countering it with concrete political projects. The difficulty is that nationalism is easy to detect when it is expressed in explicit ethnic or racial terms, and difficult to grasp when it comes in cultural forms or in the language of, quote, society. For example, the dominant form of the everyday nationalism takes is through what Joachim Hirsch calls the, quote, national competitive state, end quote. By this, Joachim Hirsch means the state's efforts to, quote, mobilize all productive forces for the purposes of international competition, end quote. Footnote. See Joachim Hirsch, Globalization of Capital, Nation States and Democracy, published in Studies in Political Economy, fall 1997. I actually have a piece by Joachim Hirsch on this channel because he was involved in the state derivation debate and debates about the state in Germany. Back to the text or end footnote. It was precisely this form of nationalism that the organization Radical Left targeted when Radical Left criticized how unpaid domestic labor was being developed as a solution to rising female unemployment following the privatization of the East German economy. In this situation, all productive forces would be mobilized in service of the national economy. But insofar as the national economy lacked the capacity at that time to productively absorb the entire employable population towards these ends, the public was segmented along gender lines. Its reorganization according to the needs for the, quote, national competitive state, end quote, was ideologically justified by presenting women not only as the caretakers of the family, but of the larger collective, the nation. This kind of process is a regular part of capitalist societies today, and is present in crisis management strategies in many national contexts, even without recourse to explicit ethnic or racial terms. A contemporary example of this is the politics of the current U.S. president. Obama is not often associated with nationalism, yet Obama's public addresses are deeply based in his strategy of the national competitive state. During the tax debates in Washington in 2011, in which Obama warred with Republicans, Obama warned of a group of college students against, quote, partisanship and, quote, politics. Instead, he advanced the idea of the collective interest of Americans across political persuasions. There is a, quote, common need to make the United States more economically competitive on the international market, Obama argued, and warned that the country is, quote, in danger of falling behind the global economy, end quote. There is, quote, fierce competition among nations for the jobs and industries of the future, end quote, which threatens America of being, quote, outpaced by up-and-coming competitors like China and India, end quote. Obama said, quote, in the 20th century, the business of America was business. Our economic leadership in the world went unmatched. Now it's up to us to make sure that we maintain the leadership in this century. And at this moment, the most important contest we face is not between Democrats and Republicans. It's between America and our economic competitors all around the world. That's the competition we've got to spend time thinking about, end quote. In this short statement, Obama demonstrated just how closely connected the affirmation of the national competitive state is with the subordination of political and class conflicts. As Paul Street shows, Obama's speech reveals his, quote, belief that the dictates of the market, must trump the odious twaddle of what passes for democratic debate and contestation, end quote. According to this conception, quote, petty and silly partisanship and angry, quote, politics, end quote, and pressuring for, quote, progressive taxation, end quote, is, quote, counterproductive, end quote. Footnote. See Paul Street's article, Obama Isn't Spineless, He's Conservative, Reflections on Chutzpah, Theirs and Ours, published in Z-Mag, December 11th, 2010. What is needed is for, quote, all good market-based Americans to pull together in a big common effort to maintain national capitalist leverage in flat world competition with low-wage information workers in India and China we have been pitted against by the march of globalization, end quote. Wall Street clearly shows how Obama's nationalist rhetoric goes hand in hand with his silence on class and material conflicts. He does so through a deep personalization of the issues, focusing largely on Obama's character. It is here that the 2009 social revolutionary and anti-national bloc in Germany might be instructive. In contrast to Paul Street's approach, the bloc did not target Lafontaine's migration policies as the product of merely private views, but rather as the logical outcome of a politics subordinated to the nation-state. Without opposing global capitalist competition, the state comes to the forefront for advancing national interests and the national economy. This requires appealing to the common identity of the national citizens, pitting them against non-nationals and pinning the improvement of their material situations to the national economy's success on the global market. In short, emancipation from capitalist society could not be achieved without combating nationalism and abolishing the nation-state. But this provides no easy recipe for anti-capitalist movements either in Germany or elsewhere. The anti-national left campaigns of the early 1990s broke with the left's inherited position on nationalism. The new movement rejected the romantic notion of, quote, the people, and the affirmation of the, quote, nation as the force of emancipation. This marked a rupture with the old left's proletarian internationalism and the new left's support for national self-determination movements. Yet despite their deep mistrust of the German population in the political conjuncture of reunification, they did not simply invert the romantic and affirmative national perspective. That is, neither the Never Again Germany nor the Something Better Than the Nation campaigns demonized German society in a crude and universal way. Instead, they explicitly targeted nationalism from below and the population's role in regressive and social and political developments. While they also sharply criticized the German state, they did not produce a singular position on the state as such, nor on how anti-capitalist movements should relate to the state. Unlike the social revolutionary and anti-national bloc in 2009, who rejected the state wholesale, believing it to be submerged completely under the total subordination of capital, the movement of the early 1990s did not advance a non-statist alternative. Their praxis was wholly negative, targeting particular policies and the general trends of the newly expanded, increasingly powerful and nationalistic German state at that time. While I have shown how some sections of the German left responded to resurgent nationalism since 1989, this book is motivated by fears of the U.S. left to grapple with nationalism within the movement and society. By illuminating some parts of the history of the German anti-national left, I hope to raise the level of knowledge about the ways they respond to different forms of nationalism, to increase international dialogue on the topic, and to bring some potential insights to the necessary debates elsewhere. This process does not imply the simple adoption of positions developed in Germany by leftists in other national contexts. Instead, I hope to provide insights into a particular left attempt to analyze and confront the connections between nationalism and capitalism. My hope is that this book might encourage anti-capitalists elsewhere to face new difficult questions, which could lead to productive pathways towards an emancipatory society beyond capitalism, the state, and the nation.
The end. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for letting me look things up. I appreciate it tremendously.